Good morning to the cool people. Yes. Thank you for getting up for us. I'm Lara Downs, and this is a panel on programming the future, curating with authenticity and vision and imagination and all those good things. I am a pianist, recording artist. I have a radio show and an NPR project, and I write. And in all of those things, I curate and try to use all of the values I just mentioned. And I have invited a panel of brilliant people to share their perspectives from different sectors about current change and future shift. So I would love to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and to share quickly an example of either a success or I don't want to say a failure, but a problem, an ongoing problem, a question, in terms of the programming that you are doing in your various areas.
So I am Danielle Allen. Everyone calls me Danny, though, so feel free. I am the Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement for the Philadelphia Orchestra and Kimmel Center Incorporated. Unlike my colleagues here and most people here at Sphinx, I am not a classically trained musician, so thank you all for welcoming me into your world. But I bring that very unique perspective to my work. I will say one huge success that we've experienced in the Philadelphia Orchestra is a program called Our City, Your Orchestra. And despite the challenges of the pandemic, that program has allowed us to make very real and organic connections with our community. And one challenge has been the ability to reestablish that connection globally in terms of our touring residency. But it'll happen.
Hi, y'all. My name is Ricky Dean. I'm currently the general manager at the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, where I oversee, general logistics, but also artistic planning. Outside of that, I'm also a painter. I'm a lover of the arts, and I'm excited to be here today with great company, so thanks for having me. A success point, I think, where we're at the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra is the way in which we engage with composers and our dedication to the music of today. We spend time not only commissioning and making sure that living artists are represented on our stage, but also engaging with them and giving them time to grow and create without putting them in the niche little boxes that I think classical music might tend to do. So we let them explore creating over the entire year and workshop with them and give them the space to think. So I think that's a great point for where Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra is. I think also I'd like to share a pain point because I think it's good to have duality. I think navigating the way in which private interest and funding impacts the way in which we program and the way in which we create against institutional funding and larger initiatives that don't have the same restrictions makes it tricky to accomplish, I think, bigger picture goals without having to maintain the important relationships that come along with private interest.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm James A. Mohammed, president of the USC Radio Group, which operates Classical California, KUSC Los Angeles, KDFC San Francisco, and co-producing with NPR Lara's project with Amplify, Season 3. Very proud of that. She's also our host of Evening Classical Music, our host of our Americana stream, which is a part very different than what you might expect. Listening to that stream this morning, I was able to hear music of Letty Alston, also William Grant Still, Florence Price. So when we think of Americana, we're thinking about it in its true sense. And doing great things. We'll have a Sky concert in San Francisco at the San Francisco Conservatory, where our operation with KDFC is located. That will be Lara Downs and our good friend from Friday, who performed the Sphinx winner will be our featured performer for that. We do Kids Discovery Days, where we go out into the community and allow musicians to touch and share the love of classical music and the entire experience with families and children. So we look at ourselves in a very different way, not holding to the traditional approach of public radio that it's been historically in sound, music selection, as well as operation. So I can talk a little bit more about that, but really seeing ourselves as more than just a presenter of music, and also redefining or looking closely at how we classify classical music and what that can include, and making it, presenting it in a way that it's accessible, and it's not something that is presented as something that could be enjoyed by a few, but can be enjoyed by anyone. And so that's our goal.
Thank you.
I'm Joseph Young. I'm music director of the Berkeley Symphony and artistic director with the Peabody Conservatory. It's great to be with all of you this morning. The idea of thinking about what works in programming, has worked for me in my programming everywhere I go is trying to connect as much as I can with and listen to the community. I'm very fortunate to be with an orchestra that has that kind of history. The idea of listening deeply to what the concerns, what the history of a community lies, and it creates this curiosity and this intersection between the audience and the orchestra that continues to grow as we go. So I'm just going to stay brief.
No, you're doing great.
Because I can
Trying to stay home for time.
And I'm so fortunate to have working relationships with all of these folks, and just to experience, different perspectives and different aspects of all this work we're doing. Last night, I spent some time with a friend who I hadn't seen in about 6 years, and we were talking about how quickly change has happened. And one of the working titles that we threw around for this panel was Programming the Future Beyond Price and Still, meaning beyond checking the obvious boxes and the boxes that have very quickly gotten checked in the last 3 years. I want to just take a minute with that. As somebody who's been working with the music of Price and Still and other historic Black composers for close to 20 years, the last 3 years have been interesting to experience and to watch. And I have discomfort and concern about the digging into that repertoire and then moving past that repertoire, because 3 years is not a long time. And so when we're shifting the canon, this canon that has been in place for so long, and we're embracing these composers, are we doing enough to understand the truth and the depth of that history and how it impacts our present? Our first connection was Florence Price. Joseph and I did the Florence Price Concerto with the orchestra now. My first connection with Philadelphia Orchestra was the Florence Price Concerto. And it's so interesting to experience the response of audiences to this music. It's still so new. So I'd just like to talk a little bit, if we can all share a little bit our perspectives about what is that history. I mean, we're talking about 100 years of history at the most. And how are we sitting in that with our communities? James, I want to start with you because James has this incredible story that connects with William Grant Still, that illustrates so clearly the very recent nature of what we're experiencing now.
Sure. So I'm the son of a music educator, HBCU educated, attended Allen University, named after Bishop Richard Allen, and also the alma mater of Hall Johnson. Anybody know who Hall Johnson singers? So always known quite a bit about African American composers, performers. My father would lecture about that across the country. So started working in public radio in the early 90s as a classical music announcer. At the time, on a full-time basis, there might have been 2 of us. And the other gentleman, Ben Rose here, gentleman in Urbana, University of Illinois, and I cannot remember his name. It was really the 2 of us at the time. So I got a call from a lady on the West Coast who said, hey, I'm calling public radio stations, and I'm trying to educate people on who my father was. He was a musician, composed a number of symphonies, worked with orchestras. I don't know that you've ever heard of him. Most of the people in public radio I'm talking to haven't. His name is William Grant Steele. And I said, I absolutely have heard of William Grant Steele, more than probably I ever wanted to, but I have heard of him. But, as we're talking about and we're hearing about these things, it is, I was able to introduce his work and others into the playlist where I was, and I was actually at Alabama Public Radio. Many of these folks worked and lived in the shadows of classical music history. And that's why our role in public radio, and especially at our operation in Classical California, is so important, because we have the ability to impact what people become aware of in the art form. And so part of our mission now is in drive time specifically, you will hear music from women, minority composers at a minimum of 35% of the content. So we're very intentional about making sure that our music is reflective of the breadth of the true history and experience of the music. But yeah, so that's my story. And so ended up years later meeting her daughter and working with her daughter, who is Celeste Headley, who is you may know her from public radio.
And just recently, I was talking with one of your colleagues at Philadelphia, and there's an effort underway to do some work with the still catalog, editing some of the scores, making them more usable for orchestras. And so there was contact with Judith Ann, and one of the things she said was, nobody called me for a lot of years, and now y'all are calling me all the time. And that just made me think about the tenacity and the isolation of trying to keep these legacies alive for so long, and what that means. And that in itself has tremendous value, I think, for us. Joseph?
I'm not someone who really likes history in general. I'm not someone who kind of is in touch with history books. And the idea that we are digging into some of this repertoire, I'm not sure. I'm always convinced that we are doing that with some of these composers. I'm someone who is curious about what the intersection between music today and music of the past, and all the narratives that we usually hear from composers, Tchaikovsky's Fate, the love triangle of the Schumanns. We can name all of these stories from some of these meat and potatoes composers, but we haven't embraced some of these BIPOC composers as whole people.
Exactly.
And I really think there's something about the way that we present these concerts in saying rediscovered, amplifying voices. That is going to die. Mm-hmm. We now need to understand who these people are as whole people. We need to understand their drive, their personal life. And I think those kind of narratives are so important to continue keeping this music alive. And I just wanted to point to a project that I'm doing with Lara is this idea about Duke Ellington that she introduced me to, that I was not aware of. It introduced him as a whole person. And how can I introduce that to my audience? I feel that's the only way that we can continue to keep this idea of amplifying these voices, give them the full voice, person that they are.
Thank you. I want to go on to the two of you, but I want to share two or possibly three thoughts along those lines. I don't want anymore to meet with audience members after a concert where this music has been played and hear, it's so important for us to be be playing this music now. It's so important to be hearing this music now. Why? What does, yes, and why? The whole personhood is so important, and I think I have multiple opportunities, especially via the radio program, to tell stories, and I try very hard not to use any of the words that you just used, or 10 or 20 other words that get attached to these composers, and instead just to present them the same way that I present any other composer who's better known, longer accepted, because when we talk about Beethoven, we kind of have to dig deep to be creative with our storytelling, right? And I think we should do the same with Florence Price and William Grant Still. And then I just want to share one of the happiest, clarifying moments for me in the last few years. Just about a year ago, I played the Price Concerto just down the road here with the DSO, and we had main stage concerts, but it was also the first time that they had school kids back after the pandemic. And so we played the concerto, we broke it up into sections, and I was introducing each of the 3 sections to the kids, again, not using any of those words, but trying to present her as this fascinating woman, who was courageous and who had this imagination and all the places she was pulling from in her own narrative and her own background. And the kids were so responsive, and it was just, because they didn't have any other context for that room. Like, this was new, the whole thing was new. And when I went back to my dressing room, I literally just sat down on the couch and realized what that had meant, that they'd come into that space for the first time without any preconceptions about what they were going to hear, and what they heard was that, introduced in such a way that they felt embraced and reflected and invited. And I wish I could play this music for the first time for kids all the time, just to cut through, those layers of stuff. So I think for all of us, the job is stripping away the layers of stuff. Yeah.
I'm very proud that the Philadelphia Orchestra, has sort of delved into this work, but that we're not just leaving it in this moment of 2 or 3 years. We're doing a great job of normalizing this music. I mean, the point of music is to share stories and to convey messages, and people are moved by this music. And we were very bold in taking the music of Florence Price on tour throughout Europe. And a lot of presenters were kind of no, we don't want that. And we're like, well, if you want us, you will have the Florence Price. And so, again, I'm not sure if everyone has heard of the Special Music School at the Kaufman Music Center in New York City, but their students wrote a book. Hi, oh my goodness. Their brilliant students wrote a book about Florence Price because they're like, why don't we know about this woman? And so, I'm an educator. So I'm like, well, how can we teach children about these lesser-known BIPOC composers? And we're actually bringing their students to Philadelphia to do a family concert for our students. And we will continue to do that work with William Grant Still and other composers because, again, it is important that we know these people, know their music, and know them as human beings. I laugh because I went to Clark Atlanta University, which is an HBCU in Atlanta, Georgia, and Florence Price was on faculty there, and I never once heard her name. Mm-hmm. And, in my work, I say that cannot happen. Mm-hmm. Her music is so beautiful, and, again, we just had our Martin Luther King concert, and we performed some works by Margaret Bonds, and everyone in the chapel at Girard College in Philadelphia, we were all fighting back tears. So that's where we see our community's reaction and we have to respond to it. And so we have to program and we have to tell their stories. It's very important that we ensure that this is not just a moment in time.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to chime in. One sec. I think it's important that we state that when we're talking about people like Margaret Braun, Florence Price, and Undine Smith Moore, people you may have never heard of, Eugene Hancock, Alma Blackman, for people like me, that's normal.
Right.
It's as normal as Tchaikovsky, Debussy. That's what I heard growing up in our homes. And so when these things are being introduced, it's normal for a huge population of the people, particularly as we're talking about people coming out of HBCU cultures and the legacy African American musicians and musicians of color. They've been performing these works for quite some time, and they've had their space. It's just getting bigger, and I'm happy to see that. But these are names that I grew up hearing in my home, since a little kid. More again, when you have a music educator in the house, you hear stuff you don't want to hear because it's good for you, like medicine.
I'm hearing a lot from my colleagues about the way in which audiences are engaged, communities are engaged in contextualizing the history, particularly of these composers, but I think a lot about the omnidirectional way in which that conversation has to work, and the musicians that are employed and engaged by the AFM, who oftentimes need to have conversations about it in order to sort of get brought up to speed. I think your point about Florence Price and her position and you not really even hearing her name speaks a lot to the way in which classical musicians and major American orchestras missed important aspects of their music education. And in order for this context, I think, to be richer, we have to think behind the curtain as much as we think about the audience.
Yeah, exactly, Joseph.
I just want to pick up on all of that. And I want to be bold and say, my music education failed me. Because some of the things that you've said you've heard all your life and you experienced, I had no idea. Yeah. And so I just take that, I want people to take that in, especially artistic leaders to take that in. And don't be afraid to be that curious leader. Say, I am presenting to you this music because I'm curious as well. Right. You know, as we create those kind of, when you open up that vulnerability that you are curious around these voices that haven't been heard, your audience will come on that journey with you. And so I want leaders to take in the fact that it's to own the fact your musical education may have failed you, but now you have this opportunity to, you know, enrich yourselves and enrich people around you, and it's a lot more joyful to everyone involved if you change that narrative instead of saying we have failed, we have been failed. Let's talk about moving forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love being here so much because we're with all these young people, and I do know for a fact that their music education is filling that gap. And I hope so much that we are the last generation to say that. And I'm kind of up and down about that. Sometimes I think it's true. Sometimes I think I just, have a very small window and I don't really know if this change is happening. But I do know that we have to be active about this every day and not have assumptions.
I also want to think about, in the idea of education. I also teach at the Peabody Conservatory, and we're always talking about redefining the canon, redefining the curriculum, and what can we bring? And you think of all of these professors who are actually opening up textbooks and trying to align those storytelling. And it goes along the same idea of programming. I presented an idea to many orchestras. I was very inspired when I heard Florence Price's Ethiopia Shadows. It's a piece that resonated with me, but there are no program notes. But I always heard the beginning of that piece as, it was written, tell me when to stop. Was written in the 1930s when Ethiopia were sending immigrants over to the United States to go to college and you see a better life. There was the whole war that was happening in Ethiopia as well. Now, I had to go read history books, which I don't like, because this piece had no program notes. This piece had no program notes, but for me, once I unlocked that idea of these people, students from Ethiopia making this scared trek to America, I often made that same correlation with the beginning of Dvorak 9. And I said, what if we do one movement of Dvorak 9, then I do a movement of Ethiopian Shadow, then do a movement of Dvorak 9. I tried to sell that to professional orchestras, and they said, this is a little risky, that's a little daring. I don't know if we can do that. But it was this new type of storytelling that I wanted the audience to experience. And then I realized I'm teaching at a conservatory where I can take those experiments and bring them to life. And not only is that experiment brought to life, it's teaching these students that there's a new way of programming. There's a new way of playing on the ideas that we're talking about. We don't have to do new piece concerto symphony, or BIPOC symphony and then Tchaikovsky. We don't have to. It still works. It can sell tickets, but you have to find a way to retell these stories that keep an audience engaged. It's about how we tell those stories. Sorry.
Thank you.
Again, you need to put a time on
but it's so true. Everything you're saying too. Like, I'm realizing as I'm listening to you that taking the risks or kind of being the pushers, the insisters about this stuff. It's a tremendous amount of agency.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And to take that to the next generation is probably the most powerful thing we can do. So we're talking about what we're programming and how, and there's also the big question about who we're programming for, and I want to move into that conversation. And maybe Joseph and I, we could start by showing off a little bit about this amazing program that we're developing for April in Berkeley, because we're working hard at this, and I think it's a demonstration of sort of going beyond in terms of inviting an audience and engaging that audience and reimagining who that audience is. Do I have to do this?
Yeah.
All right. So we met, as I said, last year at Bard College, and really enjoyed working together, and I loved watching Joseph also with that orchestra. And then we went out drinking. And I was all excited for some reason that night about Duke Ellington's New World A-Coming, which is a piece that I wish I could play all the time. This is a piece, if you don't know, that he wrote in the 40s with a backstory behind it that has to do with a book by Roy Ottley, the journalist, and then a radio program that was just telling first-person narratives of life in Harlem during those years. New World A-Coming was Ellington's vision of what the world could be after the war, the end of colonialism, the end of racism, the end of fascism, a world of love and peace and brotherhood. And it's just an amazing piece of music. So I was filling Joseph's ear with that. You knew the piece, but not that much about it. And then I mentioned that I was at that same time working on a new concerto built on music by Billy Strayhorn, which I was going to play with Philadelphia and Louisville and Boston Pops. And so we started talking about the Strayhorn-Ellington relationship. So here we are, just about a year later, and in April we're doing a program in Berkeley with the New World A-Coming, the Strayhorn Concerto, and tell about the rest of the program, and then I want to talk about the community piece.
And what she inspired me, what's so inspiring about this story as well is that was our first time working together, and this musical connection happened, but she also connected me to other musical connections. So we're creating this concert cycle about about musical connections, Enigma variations. I have a new composer friend, I like to say Juan Pablo Contreras. And so we're creating this whole idea of sharing how the joy of music brings people together. And then Lara had this great idea to continue that into the community.
Okay, see, now I'm going to be glad to take us over time. So I'll make this quick. So in June of last year, I launched this initiative, which was actually inspired by Margaret Bonds and her credo. And it's called I Believe. It's just a national call to young people, started with kids, to create a credo for our own time. And so in thinking about what that can imply, there's so many pieces of music, so many creative visions that connect with the theme of intention and action and the power of creativity. And certainly Ellington's New World A-Coming is one of those pieces. So we're taking that initiative, the I Believe initiative, and sort of backing out of the concert, going into the schools in Berkeley, working with the young people, and then inviting them into the concert with their parents, all around this theme of what we believe internally and how we express that. And so I think that accomplishes two things. I think it creates a dialogue out of this project. And also, when you talk about introducing a composer in the fullness of self, we're not talking about American music history, we're not talking about jazz history, we're talking about Duke Ellington and what this guy believed in and what he hoped for and how he expressed it through music. So I think, we're so excited about this. And I'm working, with presenters everywhere saying, how do we back out of whatever it is we want to do in a year or a year and a half, and work from the outside in. And you were talking to me about that, like just that kind of that mission, and how that's happening in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I mean, sort of multi-layered, right? We're in a really important time where I'm proud to say, like, we started this work before the pandemic, and we have amazing leadership in our music director, Yannick Nazesigan, and our CEO, Matthias Tarnopolsky, and they have sort of pushed us into this area where, it is very mission-centric for us to do this work and get it out to the communities, not just to young people, but to the community at large, to just foster an appreciation for this new music.
Yeah, and you were talking to me about, I think, sort of shifting the directionality of how you define community. Where does it start? Where does a project start? And where does it end?
It's a bit cyclical, right? So for as much as we go out into the community also informs us. And so we have taken a new approach to sort of our community engagement, where we're asking and listening. I mean, that came up a lot, where we're listening to the community to see what they want to hear from us. And they want to learn, they want to know the backstory, because it helps them connect better with the product, with the music. And that is the good thing about delving into this music. It takes a lot of research. I'm not a history buff either, but I'm grateful for colleagues like Nicole Jordan, who's our principal librarian, who does a lot of this research. And we all connect so deeply with the work that we sort of have no choice but to share it in this very organic and genuine way.
Yeah. Ricky, I know you have thoughts about this too.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I try to avoid the word community. I think it's a really interesting word in an orchestral space. When I think about orchestras, I really wonder if they know their community, and I think often they might not. I think there's even potentially a crisis of community, and we've been investigating what that can actually mean for us, engaging with our community, listening like you're talking about, but also who is our community and why are they our community? Because it's such a massive word, and I think it gets thrown at a general public, but that might not necessarily be the case. And I think there's a lot of education involved when it comes to, I think, a lot of what you're talking about bringing people along for the journey, but also making sure that the people you're bringing along are engaged and want to be along for the journey. And there's deeper purpose behind that than just, I think, casually using these words, which have massive implications. So really examining that, I think, is important, as opposed to just applying it writ large.
And one thing that you and I were talking about recently too is, is the word community or is the word communities? And in a city like Los Angeles, what does that imply?
Right. I think that it implies something much bigger than one person can speak to. But ultimately, are you hurting yourself as an organization by trying to tackle something as large as every single community in one city? And instead, if you focus on actually the work itself, the music on the stage, and trying to tell those stories, does that then big community come to you or not? And sorting that out. I think it's not as clear-cut as having a community that you choose and then, quote-unquote, serving them. Serve is another word I love to avoid in the classical music space, but I think it gets thrown around all the time,
Yeah.
I think you pose a wonderful question, and I think sometimes it really depends on the location and sometimes the circumstances. I mean, we like to say that we are the Orchestra of Philadelphia, but we have not always historically done a great job of connecting to all of the various communities within Philadelphia. And so a lot of my work is creating sometimes these uncomfortable situations where I'm taking our orchestra to places in our own backyard where we've never been, but we're also a global brand. And so we have these communities around the world, and how do we create connection between these multiple communities? So I think it does vary from space to space and circumstance to circumstance.
Yeah.
But that's a great question for all of us to ponder.
Yeah. I want to turn to James. When the question was first posed to me about a year and a half ago about whether I had interest in taking on, a radio position, before I knew the words were coming out of my mouth, what came out of my mouth was, yeah, because when I grow up, I want to be Leonard Bernstein. Meaning, the potential for education and communication across that, giant audience, to move outside of the concert hall, to just have that potential to reach whoever might be listening, and to introduce this music and share the music and dig into the music. And I would love it if you would talk a little bit about what community means for you in your role in the media space.
So, I've spent a career in public media and started as an intern in college. So just to give you some backstory, my parents, pretty much all they listened to was public radio. All they watched, public television. My dad was very involved, provided recordings for a performance a day back when Martin Goldsmith was there. Ben, you remember all those of the old days. Worked very closely with public radio stations. And my mother always listened. My dad was very active public TV too. When it came time to even intern, it was a suggestion by a journalism professor that I consider interning in public radio. And I said, absolutely not. And he would see me a week later and I'd say, absolutely not. And he was a white man, and he maybe like the fourth or fifth time he came back again. And you really should consider interning in public radio. And I said, Professor Jackson, that might be the most insulting thing you've ever said to me. That's just too white. And I wonder if my black card is already in question sometimes. So I'm not going there. So when you talk about, like community and service, I get it. So I come from, this background of in this house where they're consuming all this public radio, and I'm very familiar with it, but feeling like I don't know that I even belong in what I see my dad involved in and what my parents financially support. So there's been this perception that public radio serves a specific community. And I talked about Classical California attacking sound, music selection, and operation. Sound, for one, there's almost a trademark sound to public radio. And so when we talk about community, it's about looking inward and saying, okay, do we need to sound like a cookie cutter type of thing? And I admit I probably sound like the average public radio. It's just the way I talk. I swear. But so we're thinking about it very differently, because we're going to do in SoCal the same, I believe, project at Watts Learning Center that we're going to be talking about Credo, Margaret Bond's, that piece based on the writings of Du Bois. And how do we make the presentation of the music accessible? How do we talk about it in a way that sounds human? Everyone is not sounding the same. I love to show pictures of our announcers. We have announcers with pink hair, blue hair. It looks like a punk band half the time. One of our coolest announcers is older gentleman, Alan Chapman. He makes me feel like an old man. He drives a fancier sports car. I got a sedan. It's about understanding that we have to do more than just present music. What is our role in the cultivation of talent? What is our role in working directly with orchestras? What is our role in helping the public understand the meaning behind classical music? What is our role in redefining classical music as a genre? And I want to say Frideria spoke about music and genre, and she talked about mood and function, that most of our listeners are tuning in because the music helps them to relax. And what we understand when we look at music in the broader sense, so you could hear on our station a film score music from Terrence Blanchard or the Five Bloods, or other work from other composers, that people can see themselves in what we do, that we're talking to the audience in a broader sense, and we're embracing the broader audience, and we're present. We haven't always been present, and there were many years in public radio and even public television, there was no marketing budget. Like, we don't need to market. we're public radio, we're public TV. You're educated, you should find us. But we're understanding that, we have something to offer and we have a role in the community, so we must be present. I'm out everywhere. You can find me from Watts to Hollywood to Beverly Hills to wherever I'm going to give a human touch to the work that we do. But I hope I'm answering your
It's
question
true.
here.
No, I was going to say, how long have you, James just moved to LA, and I think nobody told him about traffic. So he's like literally all over the place, going to everything every night. It's great to see that.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a great answer, and
Yeah,
I
but
think
but the community, and it's like what he was saying. When you look at just in SoCal, when I visit Orange County, I have only visited Orange County.
right.
And so you have to take the time and recognize the importance of being present. And in my role, I have to be a living example of who we say we are. If we say that we want to develop an appreciation, a love for classical music for all, you need to see that in the leader. And you can't have a leader who only shows up at Disney Hall. I'll show up at Macedonia Baptist Church too. I'll show up at San Marino Presbyterian Church. Pasadena. I was in Pasadena. I'm literally all over the place in order to kind of create that presence. And also a level of comfort. And I think it does matter that, I'm a person of color when I go into communities of color. It does matter. It matters that I'm a graduate of an historically black college. It matters that both of my parents are graduates of historically black colleges. My son is a graduate of historically black college. I am steeped in the culture of the community that raised me, but I was raised to have an appreciation for all communities. And as my dad said, you belong wherever you are. He put the word hell in there, but you belong wherever you are. And that's how we establish community, is in that way.
How many people in this room are working in presenting capacities? Yeah, great. We will be taking questions in a few minutes, and one of the things I would love to talk about with you, one of the things I think we're all thinking about, whether you're talking about the huge reach of radio, or whether you're talking about the opportunities that we had during this time of digital streaming everything, to sort of reimagine the size and scope and whereabouts of our audience, the challenge of then converting that back into the physical space is something that I know is on everybody's mind, and I know it's been a rough restart, and we're just trying to figure out where the bodies are, the live ones, I mean. So maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A. But in the meantime, I would love to talk about new work and the power of new work. I want to just share, I think, the most exciting experience that I've had as an audience member in quite a while was when I went down to LA for the opening night of Omar, which was written by two friends of mine, and saw that very large hall filled with, the audience of everybody's dreams, like this beautifully mixed audience, and just so much excitement about that piece, just sort of bearing witness to that moment. I think that the success of that piece has to do with, the work itself, and also with the storytelling around it, and presenting not work that exists that has been, whatever you want to call it, discovered or rediscovered or uncovered or whatever, and just sort of tweaking that story, but to create something new intentionally for a new audience. Ricky, you and I have talked about the commissioning piece and the power of that, and Joseph, that's something that you're also, really exploring to the limits, but maybe we can all share about new work and the power of that to create a new audience.
I want to say how it works and also how it doesn't work. One of the issues that I am facing is creating the silos. Silos are the beginning of, causing, a little chaos in the system. And hopefully it turns into, this melding of two worlds. But I have to say that in the orchestral world, silos haven't really been pushed into that melding of shared space. And that's not working for us. We're going to continue to see these areas where I'm going to commission a Black composer, not I'm going to commission this amazing person who's happens to be Black. That we're not there yet, and that's still kind of frustrating. And again, I think it's the way that we introduce these works, the way that we introduce the people. At Berkeley, the idea of composer in residence is, blanketed in our world, but I'm not sure how many people get that person invested into the community and into the institution and talk about, what are you programming? Have you heard this piece? Can you talk to me more about, who really wants to be invested in the community, in the institution for a longer period of time? If you're calling it a composer in residence, I would ask that we all rethink on the engagement of the institution and that person and what that means to you. But there's something about introducing an artist to your institution that changes not only the landscape of the institution, but amazingly that artist, giving them that opportunity to really feel love that is so important in our organization. So I really hope in this idea of creating new work that there's even more engagement. And I'm not only talking about composers, I'm talking about soloists. Soloists have some great ideas. I'm talking about, guest musicians, tenured track musicians who are just new to the orchestra. Let's get to know what makes them click, how they can be embedded into the fabric of this bigger institution.
Ricky, I want you to speak to this too, but I just want to say that I think one of the shifts that I've experienced during these last years is really a willingness for this collaboration, the artist-presenter, artist-institution collaboration to be more fluid, more flexible, more imaginative. And I find myself in amazing conversations about what does this residency mean? What can this residency be? What if we forget any structures or, formats that have been used in the past and just apply ourselves to making this particular project be everything that it can be in this particular community or world or space. And it's very liberating and it's very exciting, and I think that on all sides of the equation, everyone has to apply all of their creativity and their willingness and their courage.
I think, excuse me, it's been a minute. I think putting into practice the ideology, Joseph, that you're talking about is tricky, and I think it starts with analyzing that transactional relationship. I think we, as organizations, we write contracts with artists. We agree that we're going to pay you this much money to do something that we kind of describe. I think that once you set that parameter, sometimes it just becomes that. It's dry, and we don't think about voice, and we don't think about identity, and we don't think about humanity. And I think that when you want to put these things into practice, it starts with listening, and it starts with figuring out who these people are, what they want to say, and then, giving them not just a platform, but also allocating dollars in your budget to make these things happen. Looking at a residency is, you can have a week or you can have a year, but are you doing, I think, organically what the artist wants to accomplish with their voice and speaking directly to the people that they resonate with and that, want to hear from them. So if you don't allocate the money, if you don't commit to actually listening and doing what the artist wants to do, then a lot of what you're accomplishing is just a basic transaction, the same thing that I do when I go to a coffee shop and I buy a coffee. So how do we go beyond that, And I think it starts with your ears and ends with your checkbook if you're an organization with a budget that can actually make a change.
In hearing you speak, it makes me think about our work with Gabriella Lena Frank, who's our composer in residence. And, it is just that, the listening to the artist. And we do a good job, I think, of engaging our guest artists in our community work, but particularly with Gabby, she said it's very important that I work with students to inform this piece that I'm commissioning for the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was to be Picaflor that we've unfortunately had to delay. But even with that unfortunate delay, the work with the students has not stopped. And so she is in West Philly with our students. We fund the music education program at the KIPP School in West Philly. She's there working with those students about their origin stories. She's sharing her origin story, and she's using their feedback to inform the composition. And she's working with some visual art students at Esperanza. Same thing. They're creating art that will be displayed in our hall for the premiere of her work. And so it is going beyond these transactional sort of relationships and just making these deeper connections to the artists and to the community. I mean, we're all one community. And so just kind of blurring those lines or erasing those lines, really, to create one experience for all of us to have together, because that is what music is for.
I was supposed to say a long time ago that you should be putting your questions into the Hop-In app, so I don't know if any of you have done that. But also, we would love to start taking questions. So there are two methods for doing that, digitally or at the mic.
Hi, this question is from Hop-In, and I'm going to actually expand on that question a little bit. It says, how can we encourage higher level music institutions and festivals to include BIPOC compositions as required standard audition rep in order to encourage teachers and students to study them deeper? And then further, how can we encourage orchestras to include them as standard audition rep?
Do it.
Yeah.
That it's a question that I face also in Peabody, thinking about that even with the National Youth Orchestra, thinking about the idea of that in professional groups. One of the things that was very telling is allowing the students to actually choose. What if we started with that way? And saying, your solo, we want to hear the solo that you want to pick. And when we opened that door, there were so many different colorful solos that we heard from, young musicians, because they are already investigating in the music. So I think if we start in opening our eyes and minds to letting students actually choose those opportunities, when we think of recitals, I'm seeing more students open up to what if I played the Florence Price violin concerto.
Yeah.
In professional auditions, speaking with the committee, especially with my orchestra, I wanted to make sure that at least one of our excerpts, I want to make sure it represents music of today. And getting a list from the principals, getting some ideas from the committee, but also giving them a list of possibilities, because they know the instrument, they know what works. But for me, we have to open up and start engaging that conversation. I hope that answers the question.
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm the orchestra manager of the Civic Orchestra of Chicago. And my question is, in Civic in the past 3 years, we've really normalized checking the box and, doing the minimum of including at least one piece by an underrepresented composer on every single program, and at least one concert to be solely focused on that music, and we're now interested in moving past that and pushing the finish line forward, to keep making progress. So I'm curious, James, how you measure 35%. You measure that all the content, 35% of the content is that music, and do you count that in number of pieces? Do you count that in minutes? How do you measure that 35%?
Yeah, so it's in the selections, the individual selections that are included in the playlists that we have. And when you're talking about that kind of stuff, you have those things that, that you measure. But really what I look for is just like community pulse check. That's why I like to go out and ask people, what do you think about what we do? You ever heard of us? That kind of thing, because that's where the true impact is. And that's why I believe you have to be present to even know what your impact is, because, I can review tons of data. But what really matters is when I sit down somewhere and I mention our brand and people are aware of it and they feel that it's positively influencing them and having a positive influence in the community.
Hi, I'm Tony Elliott. I'm a cellist and a conductor, and I wanted to speak about the idea of programming going towards changing consumption, because I think that we've experienced something in the last couple of years where people have been staying at home and consumption of music has altered in a radical way so that people think of it as being some Vivaldi in the background while they're working along with a nice Merlot. And I'm wondering about a way of trying to use programming perhaps as a way of getting people to engage more deeply with the music that we're performing, because I think that's the way we're going to really be able to have an excitement towards these composers who we're trying to get represented more fully. I wonder if you all could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of that is about the experience that you can have.
We have been focused on a lot about who is listening, and we have to, this might be really meta thinking, but we have to go back to why everyone is listening. The concert hall is a sanctuary. People are coming to connect to each other. People are coming to experience each other, and we need to have that sense of storytelling on why you're listening and convincing people. When you think of consumption, why are people listening to something for 1 minute? And how can we turn that into 5 minutes? And we have to start telling that sense of storytelling. And, I hear some people talking about, getting away from the idea of community, and I keep talking about releasing the silos. Because when we get into this concert hall, we have to absorb this music together in a way. And we have to figure out how to make that connective tissue to everyone in the room, and we haven't done that. We haven't told those stories enough to really grab someone's heartstrings and say, God, I got to go to that symphony.
I agree that it is the storytelling. In my intro, I mentioned our City Orchestra as a digital series where we go out into the community and tell these amazing community stories. And in analyzing data about the series, we saw that people were sort of dropping off at the music. And so they wanted to hear these really compelling stories. And so we changed the format of the digital series, but it also informed what we could be doing on our main stage. I think we are maybe the only orchestra who has a resident storyteller, narrator, and host in that of Charlotte Blake Alston. And we have brought her onto the stage just to tell story and bring context to some of the works that we are programming. And it really helps the audience engage with the music and feel more knowledgeable about what they're hearing, and they want to hear it beyond just a minute or two. And we're starting to see now where Yannick is even doing that from the podium, where he's starting to tell stories and give a lot of background information on these pieces before they're performed. And people want to sit and be there longer. I mean, after coming out of the pandemic, we're like, okay, shorter concerts, no intermissions, and now we're back to normal because people want to have this fuller experience.
I think, go ahead. For our operation, we present music and we tell stories, and many of our announcers do the pre-concert lectures. So you're able to experience that over the air, and you go in and it could be Alan Chapman, Brian Lawrence, Jennifer Hamill, doing the pre-concert lecture to provide context, because in the halls LA Chamber Orchestra is one of our great partners. In the halls, when I go there, a lot of our donors and listeners are there. And so we understand we have a major influence in how people receive and process the music and understand the music and gain greater context for that. And so we can do that over the air, but also by showing up as well.
Really quick, because you see the red sign.
I have to say, these were great examples of how to engage in speaking. And one of the things that I feel that there is ways to do this without, I did a whole concert on protests. The first half, no words, just, and no, just a soundscape with the sounds of protest playing throughout the first act. And it was one of those ideas where we were able to tell a sense of adventure without going into describing, the history about things. The way we have to figure out a different way of using the ideas of consuming music, and that sometimes is challenging the way that we format the concert.
History means story. Marketing means story. Right, story, telling the story. And I also want to say, and we're going to stop, but the last question that I had planned was like, what do we want the future to look like 10 years from now? That's a really stupid question. I think the question that has to drive us is, what do we want the future to look like 50 years from now when none of us are around to see it? And I think that our actions every day have to be working towards that. Yeah.
Am I answering that?
No, you're making a face.
What was that?
You're making a face.
Oh, I thought I had to answer the question.
Oh yeah, I thought you were doing it.
No, we're good.
Thank you all so much for coming, and we're all around.
I wasn't ready for that question.